The weight of the news settled over the frontier village like a choking fog. When the villagers learned that the cultist Hugo had seized control of the Null colony, using his authority as their leader, panic spread instantly. Fear was nothing new to them, but this time it cut far deeper, stabbing into hearts already worn thin. As terror took hold, curses spilled from trembling mouths, filled with anger and despair. Not again, people muttered, the words echoing along the narrow dirt paths between their simple homes. A cult is involved, one man cried out, his face drained of color. The devil is coming, the devil. Others quickly took up the cry, forming a chorus of hopelessness that threatened to crush the village's spirit. In their eyes, a cultist commanding a monster colony was a death sentence. There was no way they could endure this again. Seeing the villagers spiral into panic, the village chief spoke with a troubled expression. He explained that a request for reinforcements had already been sent to the lands of Count Ventra, the nearest ally, but even at full speed it would take at least 7 days. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, his gaze drifting toward the dark tree line that hid their looming fate. 7 days was an eternity with monsters already so close. Pullman, the leader of the village watch militia, ground his teeth in frustration. The harsh sound echoed in the sudden silence after the chief finished speaking. He looked at his men, farmers and laborers, clutching rusted spears, and asked through clenched teeth if there was truly no choice but to endure. His voice was rough with helpless anger, that of a man desperate to fight, yet seeing no road to victory. Then Cries stepped forward, his boots steady against the dry earth. It might not even take 7 days, he said. His interruption drew every eye toward him. In a calm, confident tone, he added that if their plan worked, things could change quickly. His voice did not waver, carrying the sharp certainty of someone who had already considered every variable. Pullman stared at him in shock. He looked between Cries and the others, stunned that this group of outsiders had already formed a plan while the rest of the village was preparing for death. With firm resolve, Enkrid stepped forward to reassure the villagers, his shadow stretching across the path. He spoke with a weight that demanded silence. He gestured toward the walls, the small houses, and the cultivated fields, the result of years of struggle in a hostile land. This is the foundation they built, he said. His voice dropped, hard and unyielding, and I won't let a single null trample it. Soon, another dawn broke over the frontier village. The sky was stained in bruised purples and pale, sickly orange as the sun forced its way up. The quiet morning shattered when the bell rang again, signaling another null assault. Its frantic clang sent birds scattering from the rooftops. Outside the wooden walls stood Enkrid and Lugern, ready to fight. Tall grass brushed their legs as they faced the open ground, their figures stark against the rising light. Inside the fortifications, Cries and Pin stared in disbelief as the nulls approached. This was not the chaotic swarm they had expected. This time, the nulls carried ladders. The sight was surreal, hulking, fur-covered beasts advancing with crude wooden siege tools in their hands. Cries, Pin, and the villagers could hardly believe what they were seeing. The monsters had built ladders. It was a horrifying evolution. They were no longer just biting and clawing. They were thinking. Even Lugern struggled to believe it. That Hugo had taught the nulls the concept of ladders in a single night was almost unthinkable. She tightened her grip on her weapon, eyes narrowing as she watched their organized advance. Such rapid indoctrination should not have been possible. Enkrid commented calmly amid the chaos, noting that Hugo seemed to have more talent as a teacher than as a cultist. Seeing their captain and Lugern speaking so casually, Cries leaned over the wall and shouted at them, his face flushed with panic. He waved frantically at the advancing tide of fur and sharpened wood, yelling, "Is this really the time to be so carefree? The moment they reach the walls, it will all be over." As Enkrid charges forward, the tall grass splitting around his legs, he gives a quick signal to Lugern. It is a silent, practiced gesture, an unspoken understanding, formed between two people who found rhythm amid chaos. Lugern simply replies, "Good." Her gaze stays locked on the advancing monsters as her aura subtly shifts. She likes that the objective is clear. Enkrid then gives the order to begin the operation. His voice carries across the field, cutting cleanly through the snarls of the nulls. Seeing only Enkrid and Lugern, charging straight toward hundreds of monsters. Hugo watches from the rear of the pack and sneers. He calls them idiots, laughing sharply as the sound rides the wind. To him, this looks like arrogance turned into suicide. They have walked out to die on their own feet. His eyes glow with the dark power of his authority as he commands the Nulls to attack. The pack answers with a single, blood-chilling howl and surges forward like a filthy tidal wave. As Enkrid and Lugern brace themselves, the plan cries laid out the night before flashes through their minds. The memory of the war room lit by flickering candles resurfaces. Cries had said the foundation of the operation was simple. A colony can only truly be dismantled by killing its leader. Pullman had frowned, pointing out that ignoring the cultists, power and recklessly, targeting only the leader would leave the Null pack uncontrolled. But before he could finish, Cries cut in. He explained that without a head, the Nulls would scatter and spread again, threatening the village from every direction. He knew their nature well, leaderless. They became countless stinging wasps, nearly impossible to track down. Hunting and suppressing each one would be a nightmare. His tone made it clear he despised inefficiency even more than death. Cries then detailed the plan. First, they would drastically thin the number of Nulls. His finger traced routes across the map as he explained how it would be done. And so, in the present, Enkrid unleashes a rampage. It is a display of martial power that defies reason. He cuts through the Nulls as if they were paper, his blade flashing in wide arcs that paint the morning air red. He moves like a one-man army, a natural disaster the monsters cannot comprehend. As he advances, not a single Null survives in his path. He cuts down hundreds alone, every movement precise and fatal, a relentless dance of death that leaves shattered bodies behind him. As he slaughters the Nulls, Enkrid also targets the ladders. His heavy blade smashes through wood, splintering rungs, and snapping rails apart so that even if some monsters reach the walls, they will be useless. Watching this massacre, Hugo is struck dumb. His eyes and mouth hang open as mockery drains from his face, replaced by creeping fear. He had expected resistance. He had not expected a grinder that reduced his army to scraps. Lugern is stunned as well. She remembers how, just yesterday, Enkrid claimed he had stepped forward alone and killed the Null leader. At the time, she hadn't believed him. She assumed it was bravado or a lucky blow. To her, Enkrid had long since hit the ceiling of his potential. She had observed him carefully and seen no signs of growth. He had been stagnant, yet in such a short time, he had become overwhelmingly stronger. What Lugern does not know is that Enkrid has relived the same days hundreds of times, in a hidden loop of time unknown to the rest of the world. He fought, died, and bled again and again, polishing his skills through endless failure. Every swing of his sword now carries the weight of 1,000 repetitions. As this realization begins to form, Lugern's eyes glow softly as she activates the frog's talent appraisal skill. The world in Lugern's vision broke apart into lines of power and possibility. In that instant, she understood that Enkrid had grown, strong enough to alter the battlefield on his own. The realization sent a chill through her. Enkrid was nearing the level of a Keyite. The sheer weight of his will was beginning to take shape, a density of spirit only true elites could reach. Inspired by the sight of their leader tearing through the horde, the village militia and even ordinary villagers joined the fight. They had seen it clearly now, the devil could bleed. From atop the walls, the militia loosed volleys of arrows at the Nulls, their aim shaky but strengthened by desperation. Men and women who had never held weapons hurled stones with all their might, driven by fear and resolve. As Lugern entered the battle herself, her heart began pounding with a strange, frantic energy. Watching Enkrid from behind, she realized he was a mystery she could not unravel. For the first time in a long while, she felt like a girl again, vulnerable, awed, and shaken. Nothing but admiration filled her eyes as she stared at the man who was carving out his own fate. Enkrid continued cutting down the Nulls without mercy, a storm of steel and blood. Seeing this, Hugo's composure finally shattered. Panic seized him, and instinct told him to run. His carefully controlled army was collapsing in minutes. One man was slaughtering nearly 100 Nulls by himself. What the hell? Who was that insane bastard? Hugo muttered as his feet carried him backward. At this rate, they would be driven back completely. The flow of the siege had turned. Ordering the nulls to retreat for now, Hugo planned to regroup and search for another solution using the cult's dark arts. But as he fled, Hugo suddenly noticed something strange. Enkrid had stopped. The warrior leaned heavily on his sword, shoulders shaking. He was gasping for breath, sweat pouring down his face. His knees buckled as his strength gave out. Lugern rushed to him and caught his falling body, her expression tightening with alarm. A wave of concern swept through the battlefield. Cheers from the walls died instantly, replaced by dread. Enkrid whispered that he had overdone it trying to chase the nulls. His voice was faint, barely audible. Someone shouted for a doctor, the cry echoing across the blood-soaked field. What Hugo didn't realize was that this collapse was an act, part of Kreis's plan. Seeing Enkrid's condition, Hugo stopped retreating. He turned back, a cruel grin spreading across his face as laughter spilled from his lips. To him, everything now made sense. Power like that had to come at a cost. He believed Enkrid had burned through his own life force for a fleeting moment of brilliance. The memory of the previous night resurfaced. In the dimly lit village hall, Pullman had asked Kreis what they planned to do about killing Hugo. Even if the Null Pack combined their strength, Hugo wouldn't expose himself easily. He was cautious and clever, as proven by how he had infiltrated the militia. Pullman didn't believe Hugo would ever accept a direct confrontation. Kreis had smiled thinly. He said that once someone like Hugo became convinced of something, there was no turning back. The smarter they believed themselves to be, Kreis had whispered, the more tightly they were trapped by their own logic. Back in the present, Hugo ordered the retreating Nulls to attack again, manic excitement filling his voice. That squad leader was dangerous, far too dangerous. As long as Enkrid stood, taking the village was impossible. But Hugo's confidence swelled as he reasoned it through. That strength, it only lasts for a moment, he thought. So why not wear him down? With a scheming smile, he decided to use the remaining Nulls as a grinding stone, slowly dulling Enkrid's edge. He would not rush in himself, not yet. And so the Nulls attacked again. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. A relentless war of attrition began, meant to exhaust Enkrid completely. They attacked and withdrew day after day, never fully committing, only snapping at the defenders' heels. To sell the illusion, Enkrid smeared dark ink beneath his eyes so Hugo would believe he was truly wearing down. He deliberately slowed his movements and dulled his reactions. Watching from afar, Hugo became convinced that Enkrid was exhausted from constantly holding back the Nulls. He noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the faint tremor in his sword arm. Then, during one clash, a Null slipped past Enkrid's guard. The beast lunged, yellow fangs bared, nearly sinking its teeth into him. It looked like a fatal error, but Lugern intervened at the last instant, blasting the creature away with a surge of force. To keep the act convincing, Enkrid began gasping heavily, dropping to one knee and bracing himself with his sword. He looked like a man completely at the end of his strength. Amid the chaos of the battlefield, Hugo slowly began to close in, moving through the shadows of blood and debris. His eyes stayed locked on the seemingly broken warrior. Convinced that Enkrid could no longer wield the power of a Qua Knight, Hugo decided to finish him off personally. He gathered his authority, foul dark energy condensing in his hand as he approached. Just as his attack was about to strike from behind, the air froze. Enkrid turned in an instant. There was no fatigue in his motion, no tremor in his arm. His speed was blinding. With a single clean swing, he severed Hugo's arm, spraying blood across the dirt. Hugo stared in disbelief, first at the stump, then at the man he had thought was on the verge of collapse. Enkrid slowly wiped the ink from beneath his eyes. Speaking in a calm, arrogant tone, he remarked that acting exhausted was surprisingly difficult. The weakness was gone. The weariness had vanished. He looked down at Hugo with cold contempt, the gaze of a predator staring at its prey at the end of the hunt. From atop the wall, Kreis watched and spoke to Pullman, his voice steady and satisfied. First, show overwhelming force. Prove that the Nulls alone cannot stop the squad leader. With Hugo's intelligence, he would have realized that numbers alone were useless. Pullman listened in silence as Kreis continued, explaining that Enkrid deliberately appeared fatigued. A cautious man would always seek absolute certainty. And so, Hugo used the Nulls to drain what he believed was the squad leader's strength. In doing so, most of the nulls were wiped out without Hugo ever realizing he was being played. With a confident smile, Kryze said that the moment the cultist finally revealed himself, he fell perfectly into the trap. Hugo screamed in rage, clutching the remains of his severed arm. The pain mattered less than the humiliation. He cursed Enkrid as vermin, shouting that he had been deceived, his voice cracking with fury. Enkrid looked at him indifferently and replied, coldly, that the fault lay with the one who was fooled, showing no sympathy for the man who had brought terror upon the village. From the side, Lugern watched the scene in awe. Blood streaked across Enkrid's face, yet his posture was perfectly still. Her heart raced, filled with admiration for the man who had turned a hopeless siege into a flawless display of deception and overwhelming power. Standing on the blood-soaked battlefield, Hugo's face twisted in rage and disbelief. The cultist screamed accusations, calling Enkrid vermin and demanding to know if he had been tricked. His remaining hand clutched the stump where his arm had been, blood seeping through his fingers. Enkrid stood before him, calm and unmoved. He slowly wiped away the dark ink from beneath his eyes, the fake exhaustion that had deceived Hugo for days. His voice was cold as he stated that the one who was fooled was at fault. Hugo's mind reeled. Everything had been a lie. The weakness, the trembling, the near collapse, all of it had been theater designed to draw him out. And he had fallen for it completely. From atop the village wall, Pullman gave a sharp command for his archers to take aim. Down below, Hugo's internal voice screamed in panic. He muttered to himself that this was a disaster. His eyes darted across the battlefield, taking in the carnage. The nulls were scattered, broken, dying. His grand plan had collapsed. The cultist's breathing became ragged as reality set in. Days of careful planning, weeks of infiltrating the village, months of gathering his forces, all of it crumbling in a single afternoon. The ground around him was littered with the corpses of nulls he had painstakingly brought under his control. He admitted to himself what he hadn't wanted to face, that Enkrid's strength had exceeded all predictions, and he had completely lost his tactical position. But even as fear gripped him, fanaticism burned hotter. Hugo's face hardened with resolve as he reminded himself of his purpose and the great mission of the sanctuary. He declared internally that he would not retreat and would fulfill his mission, even if it cost him everything. His eyes took on a zealot's gleam, the kind of madness that came from absolute conviction. To Hugo, failure meant more than death. It meant betraying the dark powers he served. Nearby, Lugern sensed the shift in energy and shouted a warning. Dark purple energy began swirling around Hugo like a violent storm as he channeled his cult's forbidden arts. Hugo thrust his hand forward, dark magic pouring from his body. From the shadows, a massive creature materialized, a towering wolf-like beast wreathed in purple flames, its eyes burning red, fangs dripping with black energy. Hugo screamed that he had summoned Lillian's hound, prepared for situations exactly like this. The beast lunged at Enkrid with terrifying speed. Its claws extended to tear him apart. But Lugern moved first. Her gray-blue skin seemed to shimmer as she burst forward, closing the distance between herself and the spectral hound in an instant. Years of hunting cultists had honed her instincts to perfection. She intercepted the attack, her weapon flashing as she struck at the creature. Her blade passed through its body as if cutting through smoke. For a split second, frustration flickered across her face. She had encountered wraiths before, but each summoner's technique was slightly different. This one was purely ethereal. Physical weapons were useless. She quickly analyzed what she was facing, recognizing it as a wraith that followed the summoner's will. Her mind worked rapidly, calculating the creature's weaknesses. Wraiths like this were bound to their summoner, which meant they had limited autonomy but immense power. The key wasn't to destroy it. That was nearly impossible, but to disrupt its connection to Hugo. Lugern declared that she would fulfill the mission of the mercenary company, adjusting her stance and preparing a counterattack. She reached for the magical energy within herself, drawing upon the techniques she had learned from years of fighting cultists and their dark arts. Her weapon began to glow with brilliant blue energy, the color of purified mana specifically attuned to combat spectral entities. She countered with the radiant blue energy, her weapon glowing as it connected with the beast's ethereal form. This time, the blade bit deep. The wraith let out an unearthly shriek as the purified mana seared through its shadowy essence. Like fire through parchment, the creature recoiled, snarling as it was forced back. Wisps of dark smoke trailing from where Lugern's enchanted weapon had struck. Lugern pressed her advantage, her movements fluid and precise. Each strike was calculated, targeting the points where the wraith's form was most concentrated. She knew she couldn't kill it outright, but she could weaken it enough to buy Enkrid time. Hugo watched, his confidence wavering as his body trembled under the strain of maintaining the summon. Sweat poured down his face as he felt his life force being drained to sustain the creature. Each moment the hound remained manifested cost him dearly. Hugo's face twisted into a maniacal grin despite his weakening body. He raised his remaining arm toward the sky, channeling every last drop of his dark power. He screamed that Enkrid should not even think about running. The sky darkened. A massive shadow descended from above, a colossal spectral arm wielding an enormous blade, its form crackling with purple energy. This was the warrior's arm, a technique meant to pierce through any defense. The sheer size of the summoned arm dwarfed everything on the battlefield. It was easily the length of 3 men standing atop one another, the spectral blade alone larger than a full-grown horse. The air itself seemed to warp around the descending weapon, reality bending under the weight of such concentrated dark magic. Hugo shrieked that as long as he could kill Enkrid, he would win, blood trickling from his mouth as he spoke. Lugern's eyes went wide with alarm as she desperately shouted for Enkrid to dodge the attack. She had seen techniques like this before, summoned weapons of this magnitude didn't just cut, they obliterated everything in their path. Even a glancing blow could be fatal. But Enkrid didn't move. He stood his ground, staring up at the descending weapon with calm eyes. In this moment, a memory surfaced. The night before the battle, the Panther had acted on her own. Knowing that Enkrid was always reckless in combat, she had secretly embedded her mana into his sword as a parting gift while he slept. Enkrid had never known about this. He had no idea what had been done to his weapon. But now, as the warrior's arm descended, the sword began to glow with a brilliant blue light. Enkrid stared at his blade in shock, confused by the unexpected radiance. He whispered a single word in bewilderment, questioning the nature of the light emanating from his weapon. Lugern, watching from nearby, was equally stunned by the phenomenon unfolding before her eyes. The blue light radiating from Enkrid's sword was unlike anything she had seen before. It wasn't just mana. It was something pure, almost primordial in nature. The impact shook the entire battlefield. Enkrid's blade met the massive spectral weapon head-on. For a moment, everything froze. The two forces locked in a clash of wills. The air exploded with conflicting energies. Purple and blue light collided, creating a blinding flash that forced everyone watching to shield their eyes. The ground beneath Enkrid's feet cracked from the pressure, spiderwebs of fractures spreading outward in all directions. Then, with a sound like shattering glass, the warrior's arm exploded into fragments of purple mist. Hugo's eyes bulged in shock as he gasped and stumbled backward. The backlash from the destroyed summon hit him like a physical blow. The cultist's body convulsed as he coughed violently. Blood sprang from his mouth. His knees buckled as the strain of the failed technique tore through him. Hugo cursed as he collapsed to the ground, his vision blurring as his strength failed completely. Lugern lowered her weapon, watching as the last traces of the summoned wraith disappeared into nothing. She stated calmly that the summoned creature had stopped breathing and confirmed the cultist's death. Around them, the remaining monsters, leaderless and terrified, began to flee in all directions. The cultist's hold over them was broken. The battle was over. Enkrid turned toward the village and called out to the militia, informing them about the fleeing monsters and giving further instructions. Moments later, the remaining gnolls are driven back. Those that attempt to flee are hunted down before they can escape. The fighting is brief and decisive, signaling that the tide has completely turned. What was once a desperate defense becomes a controlled cleanup of the battlefield. Enkrid moves through the aftermath with steady composure. Pullman, the leader of the village militia, approaches him respectfully, addressing him as the squad leader. The tone carries both acknowledgement and admiration. The man expresses gratitude for Enkrid's role in protecting the village and admits fault for doubting him earlier. He explains that he had only followed the mission he was given and recognizes that Enkrid did the same, fulfilling his responsibility without hesitation. Enkrid accepts this without pride or resentment. His response is calm and even, treating the outcome as the natural result of duty rather than personal achievement. He then directs attention back to the task at hand, ordering the remaining gnolls to be dealt with so that no further danger remains. As Enkrid moves forward, other villagers and fighters watch him closely. Some exchange quiet remarks among themselves, wondering who he truly is. There is disbelief that he survived the battle against such overwhelming forces. To them, his survival alone feels unnatural, almost unreal. A report comes in confirming that only a few gnolls remain. The assessment is clear: there is no longer a real threat to the village. This realization allows the tension that has gripped everyone to finally loosen. And surveyed the damaged wooden palisade that had protected the village. During the siege, he commented on the destruction and acknowledged that they needed something stronger. The group discussed the need for a proper fortification, something more permanent than wood, that could truly protect the village going forward. Then one of the villagers spoke up, suggesting they give the new fortification a proper name. Pullman looked at Enkrid, who was already walking away to check on the wounded. Pullman declared that there could be no better name than to honor the man who had saved them all. He asked the assembled troops if they agreed. The soldiers cheered their approval with resounding enthusiasm. And so, as the sun set over the battlefield, the Enkrid wall was born, a monument to the knight who had stood his ground and saved the frontier village from certain destruction. The victory celebration begins with a spirited display of joy as wooden mugs are slammed together, sending foam flying under the torchlit night sky. As the village erupts in cheers, various voices call out for another round of drinks while the crowd collectively urges the heroes not to leave immediately. Finn proudly announces that cheese from her own household has been brought out as a contribution to the feast. She captures the sincerity of the entire community by earnestly requesting that they be allowed to properly treat Enkrid to a special meal before his eventual departure. The celebration continues around a long table overloaded with food and drinks, with the group noting that the villagers had already swept through, once just to offer their greetings. Staring at the massive mountain of food, Kryze asks what exactly it is all supposed to be, and he is told that every family brought out their own secret specialty to contribute. Kryze is especially thrilled by the rare apple wine, noting that there are only 2 bottles of it in existence, and it could make a fortune among border guards, while the others enjoy the rare drinks. Enkrid maintains his composure and eats calmly, though he admits he feels uncomfortable accepting the village's precious food. A villager counters that this is a simple token of gratitude from the people he saved. Observing his serious mood, Lugern asks Enkrid why he cannot just allow himself to be a little happier about their success. As the festivities grow more lively, an enthusiastic older villager announces his decision to marry his daughter to Enkrid, asserting that there is no better groom than the hero who saved them. This bold claim is immediately met with disbelief from another resident, who points out that the daughter is only 5 years old and questions what kind of nonsense the man is talking about. Nearby, a small child brandishes a wooden object and excitedly proclaims her intention to join and train under the hero, only to be quickly told by an adult to stop acting as if she were already fully grown. Pullman then remarks that he likes the idea of joining under Enkrid, which leads Kryze to jokingly accuse him of betrayal. Following this, Kryze approaches the old man who brewed the wine, addressing him as a master brewer and expressing a desire to talk business with him for a moment. A villager then proposed that this day should be commemorated every single year. Someone enthusiastically suggested naming the celebration Enkrid Day. The laughter and cheering that followed shook the entire gathering. Enkrid watched the celebration unfolding around him with calm eyes. When the idea of Enkrid Day was proposed, he responded simply that it sounded good. He then added quietly that it was a fine sight to witness. But beneath the surface of that calm expression, his thoughts had drifted elsewhere. His mind traveled back to the past 4 days of battle. While defending the cultist and protecting the village by himself, he had come to a realization that his strength had surpassed its previous limits. And through that experience, he had understood something even more clearly. That without will, it was still unstable power. He had tried to fill that gap with techniques like killer intent and similar tools, but even those had their ceiling. The question that now sat quietly in his mind was a fundamental one. How does one actually obtain will? His thoughts were interrupted when Lugern, sitting beside him and seemingly reading his expression, asked him simply whether he was not curious about it. Lugern acknowledged that she had not known exactly when the moment would arrive during the battle. However, she admitted that seeing Enkrid now, it felt as though that moment had already passed. Enkrid listened attentively as she began to explain. She described how a junior knight's change manifested not in one or two specific movements, but in something far broader. She explained that activating will in those actions, like a junior knight using assassin-like intimidation or a warrior pressing well in her presence, those were techniques that could only be activated in specific actions and specific moments. She continued, drawing a clear distinction. Moving freely using will at any moment was an entirely different matter. That was what it truly meant to be a junior knight who could move with unlimited motion. She then described the next stage beyond that. A knight who advanced further would use will freely at any moment without restriction. Such a being would step into something greater entirely. She concluded that this was how a knight became a being of superhuman power. Her golden eyes remained fixed on Enkrid as she finished speaking. The celebration continued faintly in the background, but neither of them paid it any attention now. Lugern continued, her tone honest and measured. She explained that even those who could use will would only partially awaken it. She corrected herself immediately. Almost all of them failed to reach a complete state. The path to becoming a true knight was not simply difficult. It was something that defeated nearly everyone who attempted it. She then turned the question directly toward Enkrid. She asked him plainly whether he still believed he could become a knight, even knowing all of this. The noise of the celebration faded into the background as Enkrid fell silent. He lowered his gaze briefly, the weight of the question settling over him. Then he looked upward toward the night sky above them. Stars scattered across the darkness. He answered simply and quietly. He called it a dream he had held on to for a very long time. Lugern watched him closely after he spoke. Her golden eyes studied his expression carefully, unreadable but fully attentive. The firelight flickered across her face as she absorbed his answer. The celebration continued around them in the distance, laughter and voices carrying through the warm night air. But in this small space between them, everything had gone still. Enkrid lifted his head fully. His blue eyes were steady and unwavering as he stated plainly that he would become one. A knight. There was no boastfulness in his tone, only quiet, absolute certainty. Lugern watched him in silence. Though she appeared outwardly indifferent, she could feel something radiating from his words. She sensed the blazing flame that had long existed within him, a great passion that captivated those around him and drew people in without effort. As the conversation turns toward their impending departure, the reality of their differing paths sets in. Lugern explains that once they leave this village, she must return to her original duties and honor a covenant that takes priority over her personal desires. She tells him that this is goodbye, noting that she has already stayed away from her responsibilities longer than expected. In a surprising moment of vulnerability, Lugern asks Enkrid to stop speaking formally to her. When he questions the sudden change, she explains that she does not like being treated formally by someone she is giving her heart to. She makes a bold confession. If he truly does succeed in his dream of becoming a knight, she will likely fall for him. She explains the unique nature of spiritual love among her people, the Frogkin, describing it as a deep emotional connection, separate from reproduction, a rare and special gift to bestow upon a human. Enkrid, true to his stoic nature, simply tells her to do as she likes. Lugern wonders if he truly understands the weight of what she has said, but she admits to herself that his very attitude is part of why she likes him so much. The scene shifts to the following morning as the sun rises over the horizon. Viscount Vera's forces finally arrive at the outskirts of the village, expecting to find a settlement devastated by a massive Gnoll colony attack. Instead, they are met with a scene of surreal productivity. The villagers are depicted in high spirits, some of them even singing. rather than mourning their losses. The residents are busy burying the flesh and blood of the monsters, remarking that the remains will make excellent fertilizer for their crops. The military commander is visibly confused, noting that it looks like the villagers are farming monsters, rather than surviving an attack. A local resident confirms that the colony has already been dealt with and that the military's arrival is essentially a wasted trip. When the commander presses for details on how a 1,000-strong colony was defeated, the villager describes an incredible hero who cut down 500 monsters single-handedly and defeated the cultist interference. The commander is skeptical, asking if this hero was a legendary free knight or perhaps a mercenary king. When the villager reveals that the man was merely a former border guard squad leader, the commander's respect instantly turns to mockery. He dismisses the account as a gross exaggeration born of the villagers' fear-blurred memories, suggesting that the hero likely killed 50 monsters at most, not 500. He labels Enkrid an arrogant fool who is inflating his own fame and remarks that if they ever meet, he intends to teach the squad leader his proper place. While the Viscount's men sneer in the village, Enkrid's squad is already far away, navigating a mountain pass. Kryze is in a state of pure elation, waving a map and shouting that all their hardships are finally about to pay off. He is consumed by curiosity regarding the nature of the treasure they are hunting, while Lugern remains with the group for the time being. Lugern admits that while she had intended to leave, she helped interpret the map and has decided to see the journey through to its conclusion before departing. Kryze, in his typical fashion, grumbles about having fewer mouths to split the treasure with, which prompts the others to question the state of his personality. The chapter concludes with the group discussing the risks ahead. They note that the treasure's location is roughly a day's walk from the village. While some worry that the ancient traps protecting the site might still be active, Kryze scoffs at their concern, labeling them rookie treasure hunters. He tells them to simply trust him and follow his lead, promising that he is about to show them what real skill looks like. Kryze led the small band of adventurers through a rugged, mountainous landscape under a bright, expansive sky, maintaining a steady pace. He scanned the horizon for the landmarks that would lead them to their goal. Walking alongside Enkrid, Lugern confirmed the logistics of their trek. She noted that the legendary location was roughly a day's journey from the nearest village, her expression reflecting a mix of caution and curiosity. Despite the passage of significant time, she expressed lingering concern about the state of the traps protecting the site. She mused that it would be quite troublesome if the ancient mechanisms were still functional after all these years. Enkrid responded that it would be quite annoying if first-level traps were still active after all this time. Lugern confirmed matter-of-factly that she would handle removing any traps they encountered first before proceeding deeper. Kryze interjected confidently, saying that this was precisely why rookie treasure hunters always struggled. They worried too much about the traps. Enkrid responded skeptically, suggesting that Kryze himself was also a rookie. Kryze brushed off the skepticism with a confident smirk and a wave of his hand. He told Enkrid to stop worrying and simply trust his lead, promising that once they encountered real opposition, he would demonstrate the true techniques that had made him an expert in his field. Finn, walking nearby, asked him plainly what exactly he meant by that statement. Kryze grinned wide and announced boldly that he would demonstrate real treasure hunting technique to them all. Enkrid observed Kryze with a touch of skepticism, as the treasure hunter mused aloud about the group's motivations. Kryze remarked that their desire to obtain wealth quickly and without excessive effort was quite materialistic, a comment that hung in the air as they reached a specific point in the rocky terrain. Kryze immediately set to work, referencing a map and focusing his attention on a large, unremarkable boulder. With a grunt of physical exertion, he heaved the massive stone aside, revealing a hidden, stone-lined rectangular opening in the earth beneath it. Kryze celebrated his success with a shout of triumph, clearly pleased that his intuition and the map were correct. However, instead of entering the dark passage, he wiped the sweat from his brow and prepared to move on to another spot. Enkrid, confused by this sudden shift, questioned why they were leaving what appeared to be the primary entrance. Kryze explained that this was a specialized technique, born from the intense life of a treasure hunter, Rather than taking the obvious path, he intended to triangulate the exact location of the main treasure room from the entrance and bypass the standard route entirely. He moved with renewed purpose to another nearby area, beginning to dig into the soil with a shovel to create his own shortcut directly to the prize. Kryze continued to boast about his unconventional methods, explaining that the strategy of guessing the treasure room's location from the entrance and digging directly toward it was known as backdoor digging. He claimed this approach offered insane efficiency by allowing the party to skip all the dangerous traps that would normally guard the main corridors. As he vigorously swung his shovel into the earth, he dismissed the traditional path as nothing more than a trick designed to waste a hunter's time. He tried to convince Enkrid that this shortcut was an easy way out, but Enkrid remained skeptical, observing Kryze's frantic labor and noting that the process did not look easy at all. Enkrid's skepticism deepened as he watched Kryze continue to dig, eventually concluding that his companion was simply making unnecessary trouble for himself. He suggested that while such tricks might work occasionally, they were not always the most practical solution. As the sun began to dip below the horizon and the sky grew dark, Lugern looked up at the gathering shadows and suggested that it would be better for the group to spend the night below ground, seeking shelter within the structure they had uncovered. Following her advice, the group prepared to enter the excavation Kryze created. At the sight of the stone chamber through the hole, Kryze's eyes lit up with greed as he viewed gold coins within his reach. He let out an ecstatic cry at the sight of his long-awaited prize, shouting about the gold coins that finally lay within his reach. Finn, acting as the party's scout, was the first to descend. She carefully lowered herself into the dark, stone-walled corridor using a rope, her boots making a soft sound as they touched the floor. She moved cautiously through the quiet hallway, passing old stone pillars and an ancient sword resting atop a chest. After confirming the immediate area was clear, she called back up to the group, assuring them that it looked safe to come down. Kryze, eager to move forward, peered down into the hole, though Enkrid remained cautious, asking once more about the possibility of traps before they committed to the descent. She explained that a ranger could detect most traps through basic skill, and if she had not noticed anything yet, it would mean magic was involved. Hearing this, Kryze declared that if there were no traps, he would not hold back his efforts. He immediately moved toward the chest with the sword resting on it, driven by his ambition to collect as much wealth as possible. Enkrid watched him, noting that Kryze already seemed to have plenty of wealth and was collecting more like a madman. Kryze admitted he was far from satisfied, explaining that his salon in the capital was already highly successful, but he aimed to expand and open branches across the entire continent. When Enkrid asked if he was truly that desperate, Kryze confirmed it without hesitation, stating that a salon was the best place to gather wealth, and only wealth could save a life. While Kryze focused on his goals, Esther began to sniff the air near the center of the chamber. She sensed something strange, detecting a faint, unsettling smell that the humans had missed. As Kryze prepared to interact with the treasure, Esther's intuition sharpened, and she realized the danger too late. She warned Enkrid that the chest had a spell on it and screamed for Kryze to get away from there immediately. Her warning came just as Kryze reached out and touched the chest. A sudden, violent surge of magical energy erupted from the object, forming a translucent blue barrier that expanded rapidly throughout the chamber. The force of the magic was immense, physically knocking the party members back as it sealed the room. Esther attempted to leap through the expanding wall of light, but she was caught in the shimmer of the barrier, her form becoming distorted as she was forced back. Enkrid managed to catch the Esther as she was thrown from the energy field, his expression grim as he realized the severity of their situation. With the exit now blocked by a shimmering wall of ancient magic, Enkrid looked toward Finn and pointedly reminded her that she had claimed there were no traps. Finn, looking at the glowing blue barrier in disbelief, defended herself by arguing that this was a magic trap, something she could not have detected with her physical scouting skills. Lugern, observing the density of the magical field, delivered the final, sobering realization. They were now completely trapped within the ancient structure. Esther, wondering if the ancient spell had weakened over the years, but the trap was formidable and would take 2 full days to gather enough. power to dissipate safely. Meanwhile, Kryze's excitement turned to despair as he realized the chest was empty of the gold coins he sought. Finn found a note left, behind which mockingly stated that only the one who obtained the treasure could leave. The note further ridiculed their backdoor digging method, stating that being unable to leave was the only trap in the room. Kryze became absolutely furious, realizing that his exhausting, highly specialized digging technique had been a completely useless expenditure of time and effort. He demanded to know what treasure they were even supposed to obtain to fulfill the exit condition if the main chest was completely empty. Enkrid remained calm and simply pointed toward the only remaining object of potential value in the room, the old sword. Resting on the chest, he observed the weapon carefully, noting that while 100 years of neglect and exposure had noticeably worn down its cutting edge, the inner core of the blade remained remarkably sturdy and balanced, leading him to conclude that it was fundamentally a very good weapon. Kryze scoffed at the assessment, viewing the ancient, unpolished sword as nothing more than discarded junk. However, after acknowledging that it was literally the only item left in the room that could possibly qualify as the required treasure, he reluctantly conceded and stepped forward to claim it. The very moment Kryze wrapped his hands firmly around the hilt of the old sword and pulled, his reality instantly shattered. He was violently ripped from his physical surroundings and suddenly found himself standing entirely alone in a vast, ethereal hallway shrouded in thick, swirling white mist. Deeply confused by the abrupt teleportation, he looked frantically around the unfamiliar, towering architecture, wondering aloud where he had been taken. Without warning, a colossal, terrifying figure materialized directly out of the dense fog behind him. It was a gigantic, shadowy entity entirely clad in heavy, dark armor, wielding a massive greatsword that rested upon its shoulder. Before Kryze could even attempt to react, the colossal armored figure lunged forward and violently seized him directly by the face. The entity's massive hand completely engulfed the treasure hunter's head in a crushing, inescapable grip, causing Kryze to scream out in absolute terror. Instantly, Kryze found himself thrown violently backward into the reality of the stone chamber. Releasing his grip on the old sword, he scrambled away from the pedestal, sweating profusely and panting in fear. Finn looked at him with utter confusion, asking what was wrong with him. Kryze babbled wildly about a crazy giant man charging at him with a massive sword, but then stopped, bewildered as to where the attacker had disappeared to. Finn stared at him in disbelief, pointing out that he had literally just grabbed the hilt of the sword, and nothing else had happened. In the room, seeking to understand or perhaps prove him wrong, Finn stepped forward and grasped the hilt of the ancient sword herself. The exact moment her hand tightened around the grip, she was instantly transported to the exact same ethereal, mist-filled corridor. Standing alone in the foggy void, she looked over her shoulder just in time to see the colossal, dark-armored figure looming over her, its glowing blue eyes burning brightly as it raised its massive greatsword to strike. Dismissing the panic as confusion, Lugern stepped forward and offered to try holding the weapon herself. She firmly grasped the hilt. Enkrid observed the attempt, noting that Lugern's species had uniquely slick skin, which was why her usual weapon featured a securing ring on its handle. He pointed out that the ancient sword lacked a proper pommel, making it exceptionally difficult for her to maintain a solid grip. Suddenly, Lugern froze in place, stammering that she now saw the giant man with the sword. Enkrid quickly deduced that the ancient weapon was actually possessed by an evil spirit. Lugern relayed the spirit's strict conditions, stating that they must physically defeat the entity and successfully pull the sword to undo the magical trap holding them in the room. Kryze, still terrified, asked if they could simply ignore the spirit's rules and force the sword out anyway. Lugern warned that the spirit would split their heads open before they could ever manage that. Assessing the grim situation, Enkrid realized the true challenge of their predicament because the sword was possessed by a spirit. Conventional physical attacks would be completely ineffective against it. He noted that they would need holy power or specialized magic to defeat such an entity. Understanding exactly what must be done to free his companions, Enkrid stepped forward himself and firmly gripped the hilt of the ancient sword. Instantly, he was pulled into the exact same ethereal, mist-filled void that had claimed the others, standing alone in the foggy expanse. His mind raced back to a previous encounter in an arena, recalling how a weapon had briefly emitted an incomprehensible light and a strange scent before. Reverting to normal, he acknowledged his own limitations, realizing he could not rely on a mysterious power he did not fully understand. Facing the colossal, dark-armored spirit charging aggressively toward him, he pondered what combat method he could possibly use to defeat an intangible foe. As the towering giant brought its massive greatsword crashing down with devastating force, Enkrid instinctively raised his own weapon to block the strike. To his profound shock, the blades clashed with a tremendous, ringing impact. He managed to hold his ground against the crushing weight of the blow, completely bewildered by the solid resistance jarring his arms. Enkrid stared up at the towering entity pressing against his blade, deeply confused as to why sheer, raw physical force was suddenly working against a supposedly ethereal spirit. The loud sound of heavy swords hitting echoes through the foggy hall as Enkrid quickly dodges the giant's huge, sweeping blade. The raw power of the phantom strike leaves a deep cut in the old stone floor. Looking at the damage, Enkrid figures out that the giant attacker is actually solid and heavy. This makes it completely different from the normal, weightless ghost he fought before in North Alana. As the dark giant keeps attacking without stopping, a deep heartbeat suddenly starts in Enkrid's chest. The hidden power of his super-strong heart wakes up, glowing a bright, fiery red right through his dark clothes. Filled with this sudden burst of super strength, Enkrid lowers his body, grips his sword tight, and jumps forward to meet the giant's deadly downward strike head-on. The two heavy weapons crash together with a massive impact, sending out a bright blue blast of energy and sparks from the locked blades. Using the push from the crash, Enkrid quickly ducks low and swings his blade in a wide attack aimed right at the giant's stomach. However, the tall giant is scary fast. It perfectly guesses the move and ducks smoothly under Enkrid's blade to completely dodge the attack. Before Enkrid can fix his balance, the crouching giant smoothly swings its huge sword upward in a super-fast counterattack. The dark blade slices cleanly up in a deadly swing, cutting right through Enkrid's neck in a killing blow. A sharp, desperate gasp for air rips from Enkrid's lungs as his eyes snap wide open in shock. He finds himself standing completely still, back in the damp physical reality of the underground stone chamber. His gloved hand is tightly gripping the hilt of the old, weathered sword resting on the chest. Sweat beads heavily on his forehead as he pants, his chest heaving from the adrenaline of the phantom battle. Nearby, Lugern steps forward with deep concern etched on her face, addressing him as their leader and asking what is wrong, while Finn and Kryze watch with confused expressions, still reeling from the incredibly vivid sensation of the fatal blow. Enkrid immediately brings a trembling hand up to his throat. He traces his fingers over the skin, confirming with absolute certainty that his neck is completely intact and unharmed. His mind races as he processes the sheer impossibility of the situation. He knows with absolute certainty that he just experienced a fatal decapitation in that misty void. Yet the death did not trigger his usual involuntary regression back to the start of his current day. Seeking to ground himself, he asks his companions exactly how much time had passed while he was holding the ancient weapon. Kryze, looking puzzled, informs him that it was merely a brief moment, barely a fraction of a second. Enkrid's gaze hardens with profound realization. While the physical world had barely ticked forward, the intense life-or-death combat exchange he endured felt like it had lasted well over 10 seconds. He concludes that the ethereal, foggy corridor where the colossal armored giant waits patiently in the mist operates under an entirely different flow of time, completely separated from the reality of the physical ruins. Enkrid straightforwardly informs his companions that he just experienced death at the hands of the spirit. The revelation sends a wave of panic through Kryze and Finn, who recoil in terror at the thought of a lethal entity lurking right in front of them. Lugern remains calm and analytical, observing that Enkrid is perfectly alive. She deduces that dying within that specific magical space does not inflict any actual harm on the physical body in the real world. Probing for more information, she asks Enkrid if he noticed anything else unusual during the encounter. Enkrid recalls the intense, high-speed clash, noting that the armored giant moved instantaneously, perfectly reading and countering all of his attacks. He explains that the entity was not fighting wildly, but was instead utilizing incredibly high-level, orthodox swordsmanship. Hearing this precise detail, Lugern's expression shifts to one of profound understanding. She declares that the ancient weapon is not a standard cursed object. Lugern begins to explain the true, terrifying nature of the sword, identifying the spirit bound to it as a tutor. She recounts ancient lore detailing how a legendary knight, desperate to pass down his martial legacy to descendants, committed a forbidden act by sealing a human soul into a cursed item to forge an evil sword. However, the dark magic eventually degraded and lost its original, directed purpose. The trapped soul was entirely stripped of its ego, memories, and humanity, leaving behind nothing but pure, obsessive combat skills. The entity is now trapped in an endless cycle, acting exclusively as a relentless martial instructor to anyone who holds the blade. She explains that the phantom will force the wielder into brutal, life-or-death combat, endlessly drilling its techniques into the victim's mind. Even if the unfortunate student goes completely mad from the psychological torture and experiences death countless times within the illusion, the grueling lessons will never cease. Lugern reveals the grim condition for their escape. The only way to break the curse, free the trapped soul, and dispel the illusion is to completely master the precise martial skills the tutor is using and successfully defeat the giant using its own techniques. As the horrific nature of the cursed weapon becomes clear to the group, Enkrid connects the pieces of their predicament. Looking up as a profound realization washes over him, he deduces that the elusive treasure mentioned in the mocking note was never meant to be physical wealth. Rather, the true prize is the masterful swordsmanship forcefully imparted by the relentless phantom. Beside him, Lugern focuses heavily on the devastating psychological toll of such a trial. Her expression is shadowed with deep, grave concern as she explains the inherent fragility of the mind. She asserts with absolute, grim certainty that no person could possibly endure the agonizing trauma of experiencing repeated, violent deaths. According to her knowledge, anyone subjected to this endless cycle of slaughter would inevitably and irreversibly be driven into complete insanity. Hearing this dire warning about the mental limits of dying, Enkrid simply stares forward in silence. A subtle, almost perplexed expression passes over his features, his blue eyes reflecting a quiet, internal contemplation regarding her claims about death and madness. Nearby, the crushing weight of their entrapment completely breaks Kryza's composure. The treasure hunter clutches his head in absolute distress, cursing bitterly and verbally berating himself as he takes full, agonizing blame for plunging the party into this deadly snare. Seeking a more practical, physical solution to their problem, Lugern examines the grip of the ancient weapon. She points out that if the sword's hilt had been forged with a securing ring to accommodate the unique slickness of her hands, she might have been able to simply pull the blade free through sheer physical force. Enkrid attempts to interject, calling out to get their attention, but a panic-stricken Kryza immediately cuts him off, frantically insisting that he must be the one to take responsibility for his foolish mistake. Completely ignoring the treasure hunter's desperate guilt, Enkrid steps forward with an air of absolute finality, his heavy boot coming down hard against the ancient stone floor with a sharp, decisive thud. Moving with calm, deliberate purpose, Enkrid approaches his companions and announces straightforwardly that he will take on the burden and handle the task himself. He reaches his hand out toward the ancient weapon, but Lugern reacts instantly. She forcefully pulls the sword back out of his reach, her face tightening with protective severity as she firmly commands him to stop. Her golden eyes lock onto his with intense scrutiny. She openly acknowledges his undeniable willpower and mental fortitude, but sharply questions if he treats this lethal, mind-breaking trial as some sort of light-hearted joke. Her voice carries a heavy warning as she pleads with him not to carelessly throw his life away on a reckless, suicidal attempt to free them. Enkrid meets her intense, worried gaze without flinching. He gently calls her name, his voice maintaining a steady, grounding calmness that cuts through the tension in the damp room. He lowers his head slightly, his expression settling into one of profound, unshakable resolve. He assures her with quiet, absolute confidence that enduring this endless cycle of death to master the Phantom's techniques is a task he is entirely capable of accomplishing. Lugern stares back at him, searching his face, and finds nothing but quiet certainty in his eyes. Her protests die away, silenced by his unwavering conviction. Without another word of hesitation, Enkrid reaches his arm forward and firmly wraps his gloved fingers around the weathered, leather-bound hilt of the cursed sword and is instantly pulled back into the ethereal, mist-filled void. Standing alone in the foggy expanse, he regains his bearings. Without warning, the colossal dark-armored giant materializes out of the dense fog, charging aggressively toward him and launching a devastating horizontal sweep. Enkrid reacts swiftly, leaping backward to evade the sweeping blade as it tears through the mist directly in front of him. He observes the relentless aggression of his opponent, dryly noting the rough welcome and wondering if the entity had been eagerly waiting for his return. Landing securely on the smooth stone, Enkrid drops his center of gravity and readies his stance. As he prepares for the next exchange, he focuses his mind, feeling the activation of his specialized sensory awareness. The two warriors clash again, their heavy blades colliding with a sharp, ringing impact. As he locks swords with the towering behemoth, Enkrid finds a grim sense of comfort in his unique situation. He realizes that even if he suffers brutal defeats within this illusion, he simply wakes up back in the physical reality of the chamber immediately, allowing him to endlessly train and master the required swordsmanship without actually sacrificing precious time by triggering his actual bodily regression cycle. Enkrid smiles through the phantom pain, viewing the relentless, deadly tutor as the absolute perfect training tool. Back in the physical reality of the damp stone chamber, Enkrid stands entirely motionless, frozen like a statue with his hand resting steadily on the hilt. Watching his unwavering dedication to the torturous process, Lugern murmurs that he is a complete fool. She observes the immense psychological burden he is taking on, noting grimly that even the highly disciplined priests of the god of endurance fail such agonizing mental trials 9 times out of 10. Hearing this, Finn chimes in with deep admiration, stating that despite the horrific odds, Enkrid is their only hope. She watches their leader, profoundly moved by the belief that he is voluntarily enduring the mind-breaking trauma entirely alone in order to protect the rest of the group. Suddenly, Enkrid adjusts his grip on the weapon, his mind actively buzzing with the martial revelations he just experienced. He reflects deeply on the final, flawless strike from the phantom that had effortlessly severed his arm in the illusion, completely amazed by the incredible, higher-level technique the giant displayed. Eager to analyze the precise movements further, his face lights up with genuine, almost manic excitement. He announces his intention to check the technique one more time and eagerly prepares to dive straight back into the brutal lessons. Witnessing his bizarre, enthusiastic reaction and realizing that he is actually deeply enjoying the deadly tutorial, Finn awkwardly drops her reverent posture. She flatly retracts her previous admiration, quietly apologizing for mistakenly believing that his actions were a selfless, noble sacrifice for their sake. Observing their leader's unfazed reaction to the torturous training, Kryze reminds the group of Enkrid's well-known moniker, pointing out that he is already called Madman. Finn immediately agrees with the assessment, noting that since he is already crazy, it is impossible for him to go any crazier. Shrugging off the dire nature of the situation, Kryze casually suggests that they should just let the fool be a fool and go have a drink, instead of worrying about him. Lugern, however, cannot simply brush off the horror of the cursed sword. She watches Enkrid with deep concern, admitting aloud that his behavior is incredibly hard to understand. She bluntly addresses the grueling physical toll of his plan, pointing out that given his lack of natural talent, he will be forced to die countless times against the phantom. She emphasizes the grim reality that the experience isn't just a mental exercise, it is actual, excruciating physical pain. Enkrid glances back over his shoulder, a calm and genuine smile breaking across his face. Completely unfazed by the horrific prospect of endless slaughter, he casually points out that since this isn't a real death, he simply questions why pain would even matter to him. Hearing his casual dismissal of the torture, Lugern stares closely at his composed expression. A drop of sweat rolls down her face as she observes that he looks totally fine. A deeply disturbing realization crosses her mind, and she quietly questions to herself if it is just her imagination, or if their leader actually genuinely enjoys the agonizing pain. Meanwhile, Enkrid shifts his stance, planting his heavy boot firmly against the ancient stone floor. He declares with absolute resolve that no matter how much pain he must endure, he will learn absolutely everything he can. Gripping his weapon, he humbly states that subjecting himself to this brutal, repetitive suffering is simply how a dull, untalented person manages to move forward. Watching his unwavering, self-destructive determination, Lugern thinks to herself that even a truly dull person wouldn't go to such extreme lengths. She realizes with profound clarity that he is, without a doubt, an uncontrollable madman. Despite her internal disbelief, Lugern speaks up to address his grueling process. She acknowledges his progress, noting that it is a step, and points out that only his unique madness allowed him to tread such an agonizing path forward. Enkrid listens to her analytical observation and calmly replies that she is quite good at teaching. Lugern accepts the compliment and reveals her background. She explains that as a scholar, she also deeply researches swordsmanship, and passing that acquired knowledge on is fundamentally woven into her very soul, making teaching her true specialty. She acknowledges the harsh limitation that she cannot enter the illusion of death to physically teach him the Phantom's techniques directly. However, she confidently asserts that she can easily supplement his brutal, practical lessons with her own extensive theoretical knowledge. Enkrid looks at her, quietly prompting her to elaborate on what she means. Settling down onto the damp stone floor directly beside him, Lugern's expression softens with a supportive resolve. She promises that if he is determined to try and master this cursed trial anyway, she will stay right there and help guide him through it. Offering her extensive expertise as a scholar, she promises to supplement his agonizing practical depths with her theoretical knowledge to help him completely surpass the Phantom's legendary swordsman. The morning sun rises over a grassy hill with trees under a bright sky. Inside the dark stone dungeon, sunlight shines down through a hole in the ceiling onto a thick hanging rope. Finn and Cry sleep deeply side by side on the stone floor, wrapped comfortably in their bedrolls. A glowing, ethereal purple aura begins to form in the shadows of the room. The glowing purple spectral panther, Esther, crouches down and notices that the magical power is gathering much faster than she expected. She realizes that at this fast rate, she has more than enough power to break the trap. Hesitating with her paw on the ground, Esther wonders if she should actually break it right now, holding back because she fears doing so will interrupt Enkrid's learning process. Seeing as he is so energetic and excited to complete the tutorial, Esther's bright blue eye narrows as she focuses closely on the room. Nearby, Lugern stands in front of Enkrid, physically fixing his sword arm and telling him his move is wrong. She instructs him to raise his arm more while Esther watches them from the foreground. Enkrid is covered in sweat, but looks very eager and excited as Lugern asks if he understands and tells him to try again. Esther looks up at them, still observing his intense excitement. Ultimately, Esther lies down flat on her stomach on the stone floor, deciding that she will just watch for now instead of interfering. Lugern then explains to Enkrid that his current skills mostly use the heavy sword style he learned from a blonde man. She adds that every sword style, whether orthodox, heavy, fast, or soft, comes from the exact same origin. Enkrid listens carefully with a serious face as Lugern tells him it is much better to learn all of the styles evenly. Continuing her lesson, Lugern explains the core differences in fighting techniques. She notes that while the heavy sword style values firm and weighty movements, the true core of the orthodox sword style is reading moves. As she speaks, an image of two shadowed figures clashing with swords illustrates her point about understanding the opponent's actions. She teaches Enkrid that he must perfectly predict and respond to his enemy, trapping them within his own flow of movements. Lugern firmly states that if Enkrid can gain enough experience to read everything and perfectly reproduce the tutor's movements, he will be able to surpass the entity. Hearing this, Enkrid tightly grips the leather handle of his sword. Back inside the misty void, the large armored giant steps forward aggressively, its heavy boots stomping against the floor as it charges. Enkrid lunges forward with intense effort, his arm muscles bulging as he thrusts his sword ahead. The two heavy weapons clash violently together, creating a massive explosion of bright blue energy and white sparks that scatter across the battlefield. The giant's armored form carries its immense momentum straight through the glowing mist, swinging its massive blade. As he focuses intensely on the incoming attack, he stands ready, facing the towering armored giant across the misty, icy battlefield. Remembering his lesson, he knows that stepping backward would only cause him to fall into the enemy's next trap. Instead of retreating, Enkrid boldly steps forward, staying low to the ground, and raises his sword to directly block the path of the massive weapon. The dark blade of his sword sparks with a bright blue, energy as it moves through the air. The armored giant then powerfully swings its enormous greatsword down from high above. Enkrid firmly holds his ground, keeping his sword horizontal with both hands to catch the heavy blow, resulting in a bright, blinding explosion of white sparks as the two weapons violently clash. Engulfed in a blinding white light as the heavy clash from the diagonal upward slash overwhelms him, resulting in him dying once more in the illusion. Back outside the illusion, Lugern tells him that his attempt was good, but she points out that just trying to block the attack is too defensive. Ready to try again, Enkrid tightly grips the leather handle of his sword. He swings his blade forward with a sharp, forceful motion, leaving a bright trail of blue light in the misty air. Enkrid stays low to the icy ground and slides aggressively toward the massive armored giant to strike its leg. Enkrid aims his strike directly for the giant's ankle, but the massive entity predicts the move and jumps upward to avoid the blade. Enkrid slides forward with a determined look on his face, holding his sword tight and ready to strike the opening. However, the armored giant reacts incredibly fast, its glowing blue eyes snapping downward as it rapidly swings its heavy greatsword in a sharp downward arc. In a brutal instant, Enkrid's head is completely severed from his body, sending a huge spray of dark blood into the air as he dies once again. The scene instantly snaps back to the real world inside the dark stone room, where Enkrid calmly stands in front of Lugern and mutters to himself that the fatal attack was a mid-level slash. Enkrid grips his sword with both hands, bracing for the next exchange as he acknowledges how quickly the tutor reacts to every variable he introduces. He realizes that he is witnessing a flawless orthodox sword style being demonstrated right before his eyes. Back in the icy mist, Enkrid charges forward, but the armored giant moves with such speed that it appears as a blur, catching him off guard. Enkrid barely has time to react, looking surprised as a sharp strike effect cuts through the air. The giant continues its relentless assault, swinging its massive blade in a wide, powerful arc that forces Enkrid back. Enkrid clicks his tongue in frustration, struggling to find an opening against such a perfect defense. He watches as the giant executes another precise, textbook movement, its glowing blue eyes focused entirely on his destruction. Every strike from the giant serves as a brutal but perfect lesson, showing Enkrid exactly what a flawless orthodox style looks like in high-speed combat. Enkrid thinks to himself that having a teacher who explains things so well makes a huge difference in his learning. With a wide, eager grin, he admits that this intense training is actually a lot of fun. He wonders if it is really okay to learn such difficult swordsmanship so easily and feels very glad that he helped. Cries and came to find this treasure. Enkrid's sword glows with a bright blue energy as he once again lunges forward to clash against the armored giant. Outside, the bright morning sun continues to rise, casting a warm light over the trees on the hillside. In the dark stone room below, Finn and Cries have finally woken up and are sitting on the hard cobblestone floor, watching the training closely. Esther remains nearby in the shadows as they all look toward the center of the chamber. There, Enkrid stands perfectly still in his deep trance while Lugern continues to stand by his side to guide him. Finn and Cries sit on the cold cobblestones of the dark room, observing Enkrid and Lugern as the training persists throughout the entire day. Finn notes that Enkrid has truly been continuing his intense practice without any rest, and she asks Cries if the warrior even stopped to sleep during the long, grueling hours. Cries watches Enkrid's relentless movements at the pedestal with a look of shock, letting out a heavy sigh and remarking that if someone is going to lose their mind, they should at least try to do it in a more normal way. Finn then asks Cries if he has lost interest because there was no treasure to be found in the ruins. Cries responds by questioning why Enkrid would cling so desperately to a physical skill that cannot be sold for gold or traded away to anyone else. He admits that he simply does not know why Enkrid is so incredibly worked up about the simple idea of getting stronger. Finn tells that she thinks she actually understands what is driving Enkrid now. She explains that if there is a way for Enkrid to move forward, he will take it without hesitation, as he refuses to stay confined within the limits or boundaries that other people try to set for him. Lugern looks at Enkrid from the side, thinking about how he is genuinely absorbing every bit of the deep knowledge she is sharing with him. She is stunned, thinking to herself that he is truly crazy for reaching this level of skill after only a single day of training. She finds his progress absolutely amazing and notices that the gap between his skills and the tutor's has finally gotten smaller. Enkrid brings his sword down in a powerful strike that glows with a bright white light. Lugern observes that he is no longer just copying the tutor's movements like a simple imitation. As Enkrid swings his blade in a wide and forceful arc, she realizes that he has finally begun to understand the actual principles of the sword style. Enkrid unleashes another high-speed, downward sword strike with incredible force. Lugern's eyes widen in absolute shock as she watches him, realizing that his movements have evolved to perfectly mirror the tutor's own elite sword style. She is left stunned, admitting to herself that even with her deep research and sharp eyes, she can no longer find a single flaw in his technique. Lugern watches Enkrid with a mix of awe and dread. After carefully examining his progress, she admits to herself that this incredible speed of growth is simply impossible for an ordinary person to achieve. She stares at him in shock, wondering what kind of monster he is actually becoming. At the same time, Enkrid reflects on his brutal journey. He remembers his desperate fights against the wolf pack, where he had to learn how to dodge purely through agonizing pain and muscle memory, because he had absolutely no time to process the theory in his head. Now, after dying and using his body countless times, his mind has finally caught up to understand the true logic of combat. He realizes that a deep combat talent he never possessed before has finally sprouted and taken root within him. Lugern watches him closely and comments that Enkrid's unyielding will no longer feels human, calling his endless obsession creepy and scary. From behind her, Kreis chimes in, completely unsettled, and says that Enkrid must be possessed by an evil spirit. Agreeing with him, Finn adds that they should definitely visit a temple on their way back to cleanse him. Listening to their conversation, the spectral panther Esther, who is lying down nearby on the stone floor, lets out a low grunt to indicate yes, in total agreement with the group. However, hearing all of this chatter, Enkrid abruptly cuts them off, responding to their worries with a very serious and firm no. Following this, Lugern brings the intense training session to a halt. She confidently announces that his preparation is finally enough, instructing Enkrid to go back in and completely surpass the tutor. With a firm grip on his heavy sword and a determined look, Enkrid readies himself, and his consciousness shifts back into the misty world of the illusion. His blue eyes gleam with absolute focus as he materializes on the familiar battlefield. However, instead of the immediate, brutal clash he expects, Enkrid is left confused when he sees the massive armored giant just standing completely motionless in the distance. Wondering what is going on, Enkrid raises his blade into a fighting stance and calls out to the entity, asking why it is just standing there and demanding it to come at him like before. Suddenly, a bright blue magical light flares from the slit in the tutor's heavy helmet, and a dark, eerie voice breaks the silence, declaring that it has never seen someone quite like Enkrid before. Hearing the eerie voice, Enkrid drops his guard slightly, his eyes widening in pure surprise as he asks the armored giant, "You can talk?" The tutor replies in its deep, echoing tone, explaining that before it became a mere tutor for the trial, it was actually human. The towering knight states that it acknowledges Enkrid's incredible passion for swordsmanship, revealing that this relentless drive is exactly what finally awakened its dormant ego. But right as the tutor speaks, Enkrid suddenly launches forward with blinding speed, closing the distance in an instant. Caught off guard by the aggressive charge, the giant barely manages to throw up its greatsword to block, letting out a surprised coo as Enkrid's blade violently clashes against it. A massive shockwave of bright blue energy explodes through the mist from the impact, pushing hard against the giant's heavy weapon. Enkrid boldly cuts off the conversation, declaring, "Enough talk," ready to show the awakened tutor exactly what his endless training has achieved.